Let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so very thankful for the way that you work in our lives and the peace and the confidence that you give us as we study your word, as we come to know you. We know that the peace you give us is not as the world gives peace, that we can have peace in the midst of conflict and trial, that we can have the assurance that you are leading us, working in our lives, and helping us in our daily struggles. We ask, Lord, that as we study this morning, as we look at the story of Jericho, the fall of Jericho, and as we study it in relationship to the trumpets, we ask for your guidance, that you can clearly show us the truth. We ask for all those watching, participating, that you can speak to their hearts, that they can see these things clearly. Be with us now through thy Spirit. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good morning, everyone. So we're going to be answering the question that Christian asked a couple of days ago. And this question was in relationship to the trumpets of Revelation and to the fall of Jericho. Now, it was a very good question because what is Jericho? What is Jericho symbolizing? We know it's the city when they cross the Jordan and they conquer Jericho, but it's maybe a bad question.
The church triumphant.
Okay, the church triumphant. Can you explain how you put it as the church triumphant? What would be some of the indications from the story?
Just like a people in harmony, united.
Okay, so just in the story itself, you have God's people united in this overthrowing of this city. And Jericho, what does Jericho represent itself?
The fall of Satan's kingdom.
Okay, yeah. So we can say it's the fall of Babylon. I mean, it's a type of that, spiritual Babylon. Now, we know that the Israelites in this story, they came out of Egypt 40 years before, 38 years before, when they came to Kadesh Barnea. They sent in 12 spies to spy out the land, and 10 gave an evil report and 2 gave a good report, Joshua and Caleb. And then they ended up staying in Kadesh Barnea for another 38 years until the first day of the 5th month, when Aaron dies and they bury him on Mount Hor. And then they continue their journey, and they're going to end up crossing the Jordan River on the 10th day of the 1st month in the 40th year. So it's almost 40 years since they came out of Egypt, like a few days short of that. So the story of Jericho is falling in that narrative. Now, would we put this on a line? And if we were to put it on a line, how would we see this? Because we have a reform line that happens with the Exodus. So this story here, the crossing of the River Jordan and then the taking of Jericho, how would we place that on a line? Anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, so we have a reform line over here. This is the reform line. We'll call this the Exodus. And this is going to start with the birth of Aaron, and it's going to go through, and you're going to have finally this event. And what would the Exodus on the 15th day of the first month when they leave Egypt? What waymark would that be?
Would it be the Sunday law?
Okay, so this would be the Sunday law, correct? Yes, that's the where I would mark it. And why would we mark it as the Sunday law?
Well, the Passover typifies the cross.
Right. So the Passover is typical of the cross. Now, technically speaking, I mean, we have the plagues here, and then you have the Passover on the 14th, and then they're going to leave on the 15th. But this is all connected to the Passover. And then what about when we get to the giving of the law? So we're going to get the giving of the law. What is that?
Would it be the loud cry? No. I suppose the cry at midnight would be maybe typifying that, or
So there's little things here that we have to try to decide on. Now, we say this is the Sunday law. Now, where's the close of probation? In this reform law. This is a pretty simplified reform.
well, you have a shut door at the Passover as well.
Right.
In a sense, you know.
Right. So when we mark this as the Sunday law, we're doing this because there is this close of probation here, which if we're trying to understand this as a reform line, part of the problem is how we look at the Sunday law, because the Sunday law is a close of probation. Right?
Well,
So
we have set out for the church, yes.
yeah. Now, so the giving of the law, if you had a close of probation, and we look at the events here, so we're gonna try to be dealing with the big line. So maybe what I'll do here is I'll put this as the close of probation. And so the giving of the law, how does this fit in? Because there's going to be a whole bunch of things that happen here as well. Would we say that this whole thing in connection with the giving of the law is also a reform line?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay. So can we have reform lines within reform lines?
Why not?
But what we can. So, but we have to understand what the purpose of this is and what the purpose of this is. So we know that this is all part of a bigger reform line. Now, over here we have, we'll put Jericho here. So we have a reform line, however we want to look at this, whether we want to look at this as the close of probation. This is a type, would we say that this is a type of judgment that happens at the giving of the law?
Yeah.
Because wouldn't this be, so which judgment would this be? Because we have different types of judgment. Could we say that this is the second coming?
Well, in a sense, that Christ does come with all the angels, and God the Father
Mhm.
comes to settle on Mount Sinai.
Okay,
So we could,
yeah. And before the giving of the law, there's all these little events in here. One is the crossing of the Red Sea itself. So you got the Red Sea in here. So what's the Red Sea representing? So I'm going to take this out.
coming out of Egypt, maybe coming out of Babylon.
Okay. But this is also this experience. Can we compare the Red Sea, the experience before they crossed the Red Sea, as the time of Jacob's trouble?
There is a disappointment that takes place.
Because they're going to have a type of deliverance here. They have a deliverance here. They have a deliverance here. Then they're going to have a judgment here. And I'm just throwing these things out just to try to understand this. Now, then over here, you're going to have the giving of the law. And then finally, you're going to have, I shouldn't say finally, next, you're going to have where they're going to come to Kadesh Barnea, but Kadesh, and then they're going to be 38 years here in the wilderness. I mean, there's 40 years in the wilderness, but from the time they get to Kadesh and they send in the 12 spies, it's going to be 38 years. And then we're going to have Jericho. So what is Jericho then? How does it relate to this line? Because we just had all of these things which are end time events. Now we're going to have Jericho. Of course, over here is Egypt. Do we add Jericho as part of this line? Is it another reform line? What is Jericho?
Well, entering the promised land is like a type of entering heaven
Okay.
as well. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. So yeah, and I'm not necessarily sure either. The only thing that I do know is that we parallel this with 1863. And if this is 1863, what is this history?
1844.
Yeah, so I mean, we could just say this is 1844 without real definitive things. Do we have a giving of the law that happens after 1844?
Yes.
Okay, so we could say what, 1846? Something like that.
Maybe like giving of the law.
The giving, that's when Moses gave the law on Mount Sinai. So the Adventists get the Sabbath, right?
Okay.
And the sanctuary message becomes understood. And now we could maybe put this as 1850 or something like that. This is just a suggestion that the story of Jericho is part of a reform line that happens, and it's either a building of a city or a destruction of a city that happens after a reform line that happens in the first generation. And so this is maybe not as precise as we could make it, but can we see the general idea? That you're always going to have these 4 generations, then you're going to have a reform line, and then you're going to have the first generation. And the first generation is going to be either a building of a city or a destruction of a city. Does that make sense to people? Or am I assuming we understand what I'm talking about? Anybody not understand what I'm talking about?
Maybe just give me some more examples.
Well, to me, the classic example is the 3 decrees, right? You got the 1 to 2, the 3, you have, and then you're going to have the 4th. And the 4th is the streets and walls, right?
Yes.
In 444. So this is a reform line beginning the 2300 days. And in the first generation, you have the building of the streets and walls. And this is part of that first generation that sets up this work, but it never really completes the work. That is, Jerusalem is rebuilt, back here in this history, under Ezra, they get rid of the strange wives. Here they keep the Sabbath. There's Sabbath reform going on, as well as separation from the strange wives. And then they're going to build the streets and walls. So this completes the beginning of the 2300 days. But this is the first generation, and it's going to lead to some of the things in this first generation are then going to be part of the problem of the 4th generation when Christ is born. So that's going to be this again, a progressive destruction of 4. So in the first generation, you're going to have, in this case, it's the building of the streets and walls. In this one, it's going to be the fall of the walls of Jericho. And in Adventist history, it's going to be the rebuilding of Jericho. We're going to try to understand that and how this relates to the trumpets. So that's the other thing that we have to address. I don't know if that makes sense still or yet, or.
I had the idea that Jericho would typify Nehemiah in a sense.
What's that?
It's the sort of like the 4th Jericho. I had that idea.
Yeah.
That Jericho would be that 4th, typifying that 4th decree, or maybe typifying the 4th angel.
Yeah. Yeah, so now we know that what happens here, when we look at Millerite history, we say that the 4th is going to be our history, right?
Yes.
But can we see then, though, that in the first generation, because they don't complete the task, and then we have the falling away, that we come up to the 4th generation and we once again need a reform line. And so that reform line becomes our reform line. So this ends up typifying what happens in 1863, ends up typifying our reform line.
I think that makes sense.
Okay.
I get your point.
Yeah. So, well, this is what I presented back in 2016 in that study in the afternoon that Jeff had me do at Lambert. I did a better example of it because I was dealing with particularly I was trying to answer how 1957 marks the beginning of the 4th generation. So if we go to the story of Jericho, and most of us are familiar with the story to a large degree, we know that they had sent the 2 spies in, right? And then they had come back, they crossed the River Jordan on the 10th day of the 1st month. And then they're going to come to the city of Jericho, and they do basically a 7-day siege. Now, I read a lot about the archaeological information regarding Jericho. It definitely, the time of year it matches, because you have, like, when the city was burned, you have all of these pots in these rooms full of grain that becomes burned. So they had still lots of seeds stored, and so that would fit the time of year. They hadn't, it wasn't a long siege as well. So that means the people hadn't used up all their stores of food, which usually what happens when a city falls. So there's lots of different evidence that places the time of year when it is. And so there's things that are consistent with the biblical story, that it's this short siege that occurs, and also then the time that it's not occupied afterwards. Now it's going to, over time, different people are going to build towns on it or around it, but the city itself never really gets completely rebuilt. So we still have the original walls that fell in 1493 BC. So what they're going to do is they're going to go around the city 6 days. And it says, the priest shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns, and the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priest shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up, every man straight before him. And Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said unto them, take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord. And he said unto the people, pass on and compass the city, and let him that is armed pass on before the ark of the Lord. And it came to pass, when Joshua had spoken unto the people, that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns passed on before the Lord, and blew with the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went before the priests that blew with the trumpets, and the rearward came up after the ark, and the priests going on and blowing the trumpets. And Joshua had commanded the people, saying, ye shall not shout, nor make any noise with your voice, neither shall any word proceed out of your mouth, until the day I bid you shout, then shall ye shout. So the ark of the Lord compassed the city, going about it once, and they came into the camp and lodged in the camp. And Joshua arose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually, or daily, and blew with the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, but the rearward came after the ark of the Lord, and the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets. And the 2nd day they compassed the city once and returned unto the camp. So they did 6 days. So you can see that there's going to be these 6 days where they're going about the city one time. But on the 7th day, they rose early about the dawning of the day and compassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they compassed the city 7 times. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the priests blew with the trumpets, Joshua said unto the people, shout, for the Lord hath given you the city, and the city shall be accursed, even it and all that are therein. So this is what's going to happen. The walls are going to come down in the 7th time. So it's going to be on the 7th day. They compass the city 7 times, and they blow the trumpets, and the walls come down. So the significance of this that we're looking for has to do with the 7 trumpets themselves, or the 7 times, I guess. So the 7 times and the 7 trumpets, but this is the 7 trumpets of Revelation, chapter 8 and 9. So how do we relate this? Can we relate this to the 7 trumpets of Revelation 8 and 9?
Yeah, I was thinking the walls came down, and then the walls came down at Constantinople, and then the towers came down in New York.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have destructions of cities that occur that are symbolic, especially when walls come down here. But the idea is that they go around 7 times. Now, is the 7 times connected to the 7 trumpets? That is the prophecy of Leviticus 26. Is it connected to the 7 trumpets? Because it's the 7 times. Christian, do you have any comments on this so far?
Yes, yes. In my mind, I was looking at this passage as representing the idea that the trumpets are going to be repeated, and then the seventh trumpet contains a repeat of all the previous trumpets.
Okay, so your idea is that we have the 7 trumpets, and those are messages that lead us to October 22nd, 1844.
Yes,
Okay, and that's the 7 times of Leviticus 26 as well,
okay.
right? Do you understand what I'm saying? Because the 7 trumpets lead us to October 22nd, 1844, and the 7 times ends on October 22nd, 1844.
The 2520, okay.
Yeah, the 2520. So the 7 trumpets are connected to the 7 times. Now, you're familiar with the rebuilding of the city of Jericho as it relates to 1863. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm familiar, okay.
Okay, so just to go over that a little bit, we have to go back to Joshua chapter 6. Now it's going to talk here, verse 26. And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. So this prophecy is fulfilled in 1 Kings. I always forget, I think it's 16. So 1 Kings chapter 16, under the reign of Ahab. So this is about at least 575 years later. It says, in his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun. So we have this rebuilding of Jericho and this curse associated with it. So what this movement has done, what Jeff had done, is he looked at 1863 and the 1863 chart and the organization that occurred in 1863, and compared this to the rebuilding of Jericho with the rejection of the 7 times. So the 1863 chart represents a rejection of the 7 times. So if the 7 times is the trumpets and the 2520, in 1863, what is the Adventist Church rejecting? I mean, we know
Seven
there's,
times.
yeah, so, but in a more abstract sense, more abstractly.
Rejecting a foundation.
Yeah, we're rejecting the foundation. We're rejecting that the Lord was leading us in every particular. Now, the 1863 chart, which Joseph Bates likens to a passage in Isaiah talking about writing on a table, noted in a book, for this is a message to a rebellious house. It represents the rebellion and the rejection of prophecy. So Joseph Bates saw that this chart was not a good thing in that sense. That somehow prophecy, the understanding of prophecy, even in 1863 with a new prophetic chart that had really nothing wrong with it per se, still was a rejection of the foundation of Adventism. Because not so much what was on it, but because what was not on it. And that is what was not on the 1863 chart.
Nothing on the chart explaining anything.
Okay, so one is there wasn't writing, because the chart of Habakkuk
Right.
has the writing not in a book like the 1863 chart does, but write the vision, make it plain upon tables, right? So all we had was now pretty much just the pictures from the 1850 chart, though in a mirror image of it, which is also significant. But we also don't have the 2520 and any of the explanations of these prophecies. They're now going to be in a book separate from the chart itself. And so Joseph Bates notes this, that it's not the fulfillment of Habakkuk's chart. But the 2520 is hidden symbolically on the chart, as is the prophetic mirror. So the prophetic mirror is in the fact that the pictures of the animals are in reverse of what they are in the 1850 chart, but also the week of Christ itself, which is a 2520, and the calculation that can be made brings us back to 742 BC. So we can calculate 2,604 years from the week of Christ. So the chart is made 2,604 years after the beginning of the prophetic mirror. So it's pretty profound. We're not going to go into that study right now. But this is the rebuilding of Jericho. It's a rejection of the 7 times. And the 7 times is what brings down Jericho. So if we're going to even look at, I put Jericho there as falling in this reform line as 1863, but it's really the rebuilding of Jericho that's 1863. So I'm just kind of including Jericho as its whole picture, as representing that history. Because Jericho falls, we don't have Jericho fall in 1863. We have it rebuilt. But can we see that the rebuilding of it is typified by the falling of it? Does that make sense?
Well, the fall of Jericho, as the Bible text is mentioning, is related with a loud cry, because after they sound the trumpet, they cry with a loud voice. So this is a representation of the loud cry of the trumpets leading up to the loud cry message.
Right. So it's also a representation of our history that's coming. Not yet, but we're going to have the loud cry. So it represents that history. But our history represents, if we look at the loud cry, so I'm going to go back to the whiteboard. Because part of the problem is we always confuse these lines. That is, we start with a line and I'm just going to draw this over again so we got a better representation of our history. So if we look at our history, this is the big line. This is 1798. August 11th, 1840. Then you're going to have April 19th. And April 19th, even though it's the first day of the first month, this is 1844. Then you're going to have July 21st, fifth day of the fourth month. Then you're going to have August 15th, the first day of the fifth month. Then you're going to have October 22, 10th day of the seventh month. Okay. Now, in understanding this history, this in Millerite history, we
You're
know.
not sharing.
Oh, I'm not sharing? Okay. Well,
So help.
I'm gonna stop sharing there. Okay, there we go.
Better?
I know I should have a way better setup than this. Okay, so we can see this line. We're familiar with this line, and we know that this history, the midnight and the midnight cry, is the history that's going to be repeated in our time. So often what we do is we could just go like this. 1989, 9/11, and these two symbols come together. I'm just going to call this 9/11 again. And then we're going to have what we call midnight and the midnight cry and the Sunday law, right? So we take this history and we lay it over our history. We line up these two times of the end. So you got the time of the end here for both of these histories. But this is not the big line. That is, this line here is a repeat of Millerite history. And it's a repeat of the first and second angels' messages. That is, it's the repeat of the parable of the 10 virgins. Because in this history, we're going to have this rejection of this message. Now, we'll just put the third angel arrives here. The second angel arrives here. And the first angel arrives here. So just in this simplified way. We know it's empowered here, the first angel, the second angel, and there's also a formalization. And here it's going to be formalized and empowered, and then the third angel arrives. And on the big line, Ellen White has, what does she have next on the big line?
Loud cry.
Okay, she would have the Sunday law next, right? And she's going to have the fourth angel arrives at the Sunday law. And then you have the loud cry. And then the close of probation. Would that be correct?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the line Ellen White has. She doesn't have this, right? She doesn't have 1989, 9/11, midnight and midnight cry, and the Sunday law filled in here. Because this history here is supposed to, then the next event would be the Sunday law. But the parable of the 10 virgins is going to be repeated. So that means this history here is a wheel within a wheel of this history. So we put 1989 here. To the Sunday law, we're going to have this midnight and this midnight cry. And then you're going to have this Sunday law here. And that's our history. And then once we get to the Sunday law, our line lines up. We're now in the big line. Now, remember though, we take this line, and what is the Sunday law? Is this a close of probation? Is October 22nd, 1844 a close of probation?
Yes.
Now, explain how Ellen White understands it. Because who's it a close of probation for? It's a shut door. Now, we can't say that this is this event, right? Ellen White's not saying October 22nd, 1844 is Michael standing up, the close of probation for the world. So what is that close of probation? What is that shut door?
Well, it's for judgment starts at the house of the Lord.
Okay, but specifically, who's this close of probation for?
Millerites.
It's a close of probation for the Millerites. It's not a close of probation for the world. Now, they didn't understand that at first, but she was shown that even though there was a shut door, just as there was a shut door in the time of Christ, as there was in Noah, there's other shut doors in history. She's showing that these shut doors are a type of what's going to happen here at the end of the Day of Atonement. So we call it a close of probation. Now, remember what Jeff did is he's going to say this is a close of probation, right? But in this history, this is a close of probation. The best way that we could describe it is what we would call Levites. That is, these are SDAs. Now we know that this history here, the Protestants also had a shut door. Can we say there's a shut door on April 19th?
Yeah.
Okay. So is 9/11 also a shut door?
Yeah.
Okay, who did the door shut for?
Adventists, SDA.
Yeah. So the SDA church, that is the organization, they had a period of probation. They could have accepted this message, but 9/11 represents a shut door for them. So we know that since 9/11, the Seventh-day Adventist Church as an organization has shut their door. They shut the door to the truth, just as the Protestants did. But when 9/11 happened and they weren't able to recognize that event as prophetic, their ability to understand prophecy had ceased. And now Seventh-day Adventists, as people, they have an opportunity still to accept 9/11. Now, we know that in order for them to accept this message, there's these things we call midnight and the midnight cry. We're going to go into this in a lot more detail later and showing how Jeff develops these ideas. But the main point here is that we have this Sunday law as the next event. But Adventism fails in the first generation. And so this history here, the rebuilding of Jericho, if we're going to put this as 1863, so whether you want to put it as 1863 or the history leading up to 1863, Adventism has this opportunity because Ellen White is seeing that the Sunday law is going to come. Now, this is the history of the Civil War in the United States. Is the Civil War in the United States a type of the Sunday law? Anybody with ideas on that?
No ideas here.
Okay. Now, in our movement, we started to recognize this, but it was mixed with error. And usually, when there's some important truth that we're supposed to understand, Satan is going to create a counterfeit, a false message. Now, we know that Tess was teaching that there is going to be no Sunday law. And what was her basis for saying that? If anybody remembers.
It was to do with slavery.
Okay, so she's taking this history of the Civil War. So it's quite interesting that Heidi and I, back in 2018, in November of 2018, started studying the Civil War and came to an understanding of the Civil War correctly. But that was rejected by the movement. But then Tess started teaching a false idea of the Civil War. And what she was teaching is that what this was about was human rights. And that our Sunday law is going to be about human rights because this Sunday law was supposed to be about human rights. So can we see that that's a counterfeit?
Most definitely.
Because is the Sunday law about human rights? When we talk about the repudiation of every Protestant and Republican principle, repudiation of the Constitution, the principles in the Constitution, is it about human rights that the Sunday law is about?
No,
It's about worship.
Okay, isn't it about freedom of conscience?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can look at the Constitution and we can see that the Constitution talks about human rights. But that's not the issue that Ellen White is pointing out about the Constitution. It's about religious liberty. Now, if you think about it, human rights, something like, gender equality or, the idea that all people are created equal, they are related to some ways to, they're related in some ways to freedom of conscience. The fact that all men are created equal, we can have a freedom of conscience. But the freedom to worship is a choice. Gender is not a choice, and race is not a choice. Correct? You can't just decide to become black if you're white. You can't decide to become male if you're female.
Right.
So the whole issue of the Constitution, the whole issue of the Sunday law is about freedom of choice to choose who you are going to worship or what you're going to worship. That's freedom of conscience. That's something that's about a choice. Human rights aren't about something that we choose. We don't choose with what body we are born, but we do choose who we believe. And so you can see that when you have human rights as the issue, when it's not the issue, you then can take away the freedom of conscience, which is what the new movement has done. They don't care about freedom of conscience. All they care about is human rights. So we can see that's a counterfeit. Now, in understanding then that there was a counterfeit in this movement regarding this, we can see that the issue is freedom of conscience. And that's what the Sunday law is going to be about. So this history of 1863, it does typify our history in connection with the Sunday law. And what was the freedom of conscience issue here for Adventists? Because Ellen White does write about, slavery and so forth in 1863. But what is the real issue for Seventh-day Adventists? The freedom of conscience issue.
Yeah, about entering into the war, being
Right.
drafted.
Yeah, the draft, right? And so the Seventh-day Adventist Church organizes. One of the reasons, the primary reason that the church organized had to do with ownership of church property. So church members would own a church, for instance, and then they would apostatize and they'd take the church property that people put all kinds of money into with them, right? So they needed to organize to stop these types of practices. But a secondary issue had to do with avoiding the draft, and having an organized church definitely was going to benefit in that respect, because they didn't want to serve in the war. They didn't want to be killing fellow Christians, even if they differed in some way politically. So we know, though, this never developed into the Sunday law. Now, why didn't it develop into the Sunday law? Could there have been a Sunday law in the United States in that history? Could Jesus have come back in that history?
Well, we have contended that Christ could have come back sometime after 18, but it was certainly before 1888, around that time.
Yeah.
As for the exact time, we're not sure.
Yeah.
But,
But in that history, Christ could have come back if the church would have accomplished its end, its goal, and that is, the scattered Millerites weren't going to accomplish that. But if this movement the Millerite movement had accepted the truths of the sanctuary and the Sabbath on a large scale, Christ would have come back. Once that failure happens, once we get to 1850 marks the rejection of the first angel's message, right? So that's the rejection of the first. 1863 is the rejection of the second. And 1888 is the rejection of the third. Would we agree with that assessment?
So what happened in 1850? I'm not exactly familiar.
Well, in 1850 is the making of the 1850 chart, but it's more what's happening with the Millerites themselves. So there's this period of time from 1844 to 1850 in which the truths of the sanctuary and of the Sabbath are being promoted by James and Ellen White. So James and Ellen White begin this movement, giving a message to Millerites, right, to Adventists. But that message is going to be rejected. And this movement itself disintegrates even people who had accepted July 18th, October 22nd, 1844. Even that group of people are still going to separate. You're going to have, from early writings, page 74, which we extensively went through in that history, you have Sister Minor, who is going to Old Jerusalem. You have people who are time setting again. They start to reject 1844 as the end of the prophetic periods. So by 1850, with the making of the 1850 chart, we have really the rejection of the first angel's message, which is fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. That message is being rejected. In 1863, the Adventists who remain, they continue to reject these messages. They reject the second angel's message. And finally, in 1888, they reject the third angel's message. So that's the way that I look at it. Now, this is also the time, around this time, the church becomes Laodicea. And initially, when they apply Laodicea, they're not applying it to the Millerites who have accepted October 22nd, 1844. They initially apply it to the Millerites who rejected October 22nd, 1844. So they're not going to apply it to themselves yet in 1850. They are going to be applying it to the Millerite movement at large. But we do come to recognize that it also includes those who have accepted the sanctuary and the Sabbath. So there's a gradual understanding of this message to the Laodiceans of what group this is. And so when we get to 1863 and the church is now organizing, they're organizing this scattered flock that is the remnants of the Millerite movement. But even they reject the second angel's message. And there's not a lot of Adventists in 1888 either. It's 25 years after 1863, and the church has grown. But the rejection of the third angel's message in 1888 is just a culmination of the rejection of the first two messages. They don't have a foundation. They can't complete this experience of reflecting Christ's character because they haven't appreciated the experience of the first and second angel's messages. So dealing with 1863, then, in relationship to Jericho, we can see that there's a building of Jericho that happens in 1863. But that's typified by the fall of Jericho on the line of the Exodus. And that in that line, it's going to be the first generation. So we can have a fall represent a rebuilding. That is, the fall of Jericho typifies the rebuilding of Jericho. Now we know in the rebuilding of Jericho, specifically for Seventh-day Adventists, we have James and Ellen White. So what happens to James and Ellen White that parallels this rebuilding of Jericho that we use typologically? We're not saying that James and Ellen White are being punished, but what is the events that occur?
It's the death of their firstborn and their youngest
Okay.
sons.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're going to see how this relates to what Christian is talking about here too, when it deals with the trumpets and this repeating of the trumpets, of what that means. So when we look here at in the days of Hiel the Bethelite built Jericho, he laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub. Now we know that this is the prophecy. This is the curse of the rebuilding of Jericho. Now, in 1860, the Seventh-day Adventists chose a name, Seventh-day Adventist, for their church. Is there an association with the name of a church and the gates?
There is.
Okay, and what's the relationship between a name and the gates?
Well, in the in New Jerusalem, you have the 12 tribes, all
Yeah.
associated with the name of a gate being a
Okay.
pearl.
Yeah, and normally if you're going to have the name of a church or a building or something, you're going to put the name on the gate, right? It's the entering in of the places where you put the name. It's just, so the setting up of the gates is also related to the giving of the name. Now, Herbert died in 1860, in December of 1860. Now, the Seventh-day Adventists chose the name, officially voted it in on October 1st, 1860. So just basically a little over a month later, we're going to have Herbert die. And that's the youngest son of James and Ellen White. And then the foundation. Can we connect the foundation to 1863 in the rebuilding of Jericho? How does Henry die? The oldest.
He lies on the charts, which were damp, the 1863 charts.
He gets a cold, which turns into pneumonia and causes his death in December of 1863. Now, some people really reject this idea because the suggestion is that James and Ellen White are being punished by the death of their sons for rejecting the 2520. But do James and Ellen White reject the 2520? Do James and Ellen White reject the 2520? Anyone? Okay, I think the computer froze for a second there. Did people hear my question? I didn't hear a response.
I didn't hear it.
Okay, so the question was, did James and Ellen White reject the 2520?
Well, it's been associated with James White. They may have neglected it, the 2520, rather than reject it.
Okay, yeah, I would say they more neglected it. I mean, James White didn't write the article that's attributed to him on January 24th, 1864. That's an article written by Uriah Smith. It just, that the Ellen White CD disc says it's James White because he officially was the editor. But there's no indication that he wrote it, and it's actually in the style of Uriah Smith, who was the acting editor at the time. Because James is traveling with Ellen White after the death of their son, Henry. So James is not actually acting as the editor, even though his name is on the masthead. And Uriah Smith's young there. They didn't create a new masthead for him or anything, or list him as being the editor. So James White is still the editor. So most people just assume James White wrote the article. But we can see later that James White definitely did not reject the 2520, because he accepts it as part of the prophetic periods in his book that he wrote on Miller later. So James and Ellen White are not being punished, but can we see that this is being set up as a type or a symbol, that the death of Henry and Herbert are symbolic without James and Ellen White having to be punished? Can we accept that idea?
I think I can anyway.
Yeah, to me, it's logical. I mean, you don't have to have James and Ellen White in rebellion in order for the death of their children to symbolically represent that history. And we can't just ignore the death of their eldest and their youngest in connection with the giving of the name Seventh-day Adventist, and also with the organization of the church that happens in 1863, which would be connected to the foundation, as well as the charts themselves. We can't just dismiss that and say that this isn't the rejection or the rebuilding of Jericho and the rejection of the 7 times. So would the rebuilding of Jericho and the rejection of the 7 times be connected with the fall of Jericho and the 7 times marching around Jericho? Is that a stretch to connect the fact that they go around the city 7 times as connected to the 7 times?
Oh, it's
Wouldn't we- What's
logical.
that?
It's pretty logical to say like that, yeah.
Yeah. So we can see that the 7 times is the 7 times, all the different 7 times in the Bible. The bathing in the river Jordan 7 times. There's other 7 times. Sprinkling of the blood 7 times. And there's lots of different 7 times, that they all have a symbolic representation to the 7 times of Leviticus 26. So what happens in our history then, in the first generation of Adventism, is there's a rejection of the 7 times, and that's symbolically represented with the chart and also with the losing of their firstborn, with the setting up of the foundation, and the setting up of the gates, or the laying of the foundation, and the setting up of the gates for their youngest son, Herbert. Now, this happens sort of in reverse. Normally you build the foundation, build the city, and then you put the gates up. But in our history, because it's a mirror, the youngest dies first and the eldest dies later. So it connects with the mirror, the prophetic mirror. So there's a lot to this history. Now, in connection with the repeat of the trumpets, can we see that there is a repeat of the trumpets in our history? Can we say that there is? Because we have the trumpets are given to lead up to October 22nd, 1844. The 7th trumpet sounds on October 22nd, 1844. So could we argue in some way that there is some kind of repeat of the trumpets in our history? What would those look like? Because that's the suggestion that Christian is giving, is that when Jericho falls, you have the 7 days, and then on the 7th day, you have the 7th trumpet. or the seven trumpets. They go around the city 7 times. And so he's suggesting, if I understand him correctly, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but this somehow shows a repeat in our history of the 7th trumpet. That is, the 7th trumpet sounds October 22nd, 1844, but there are still 7 days or 7 times that they go around the city. And that we could look in our history as some kind of a repeat of the history that precedes October 22nd. Is that correct, Christian? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, yes. Actually, people have made this application, and they have applied the 7 trumpets to Adventist history, not only to the big Christian history, but particularly to the Adventist history after 1844. And if you take these obvious landmarks, if you say the Civil War in the United States, the First World War, and there might be other landmarks as well, communism. So you realize that you can make this application that you can recognize the 7 trumpets in Adventist history and also the 7 seals. So just the way that Christian faith started out pure, represented by the white horse, then it has been corrupted. So after the white horse, that comes the red horse, the dark horse, the pale horse.
Right. Yeah. And that's a progressive destruction of 4. So we can definitely take all of the previous histories of the progressive destruction of 4 and place them in what we call the 4 generations of Adventism. Now, I've seen some of these different attempts that people have of doing this. Now, there are people who just take the trumpets and try to put them into the future as part of the events dealing with the 7 last plagues or something like that, which I think is an error. So the idea you're suggesting is that what happens on the day that Jericho falls, where they go around the city 7 times, this represents a period of 7 trumpets that occurs in connection with October 22nd, 1844, to the second coming of Christ. And that these are events, however one marks them, as the events that are leading to the situation that we're in today. Correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Now, some people, looking at different people's studies on these things, I mean, we have the same problem dealing with like the 7 thunders. Sometimes how we choose these events could be arbitrary. And especially if someone is not in this movement, in this message, they may look at certain events in a certain way that doesn't really align with what this message is about. So we know that there is a progressive destruction of 4. What I wouldn't do is I wouldn't start to say, well, at least I wouldn't, maybe somebody could have an application, but I wouldn't try to put the 7 trumpets, let's say, in our history, in like specifically that you're going to start like each of these events since whatever time you're going to take as our history. I mean, we would usually take 1989, but we're not going to have a repeat of the trumpets in that way. What we have is when the 7th trumpet sounds on October 22nd, 1844, that there is encapsulated within that 7th trumpet, connected with the 3rd woe as well, a history that we can parallel to the 7 trumpets that lead up to October 22nd, 1844. And I haven't specifically done a study on that where, I'm going to try to say, like as Christians saying, we can take the First World War, the Second World War. I mean, maybe we could focus upon what's happening in these different battles, maybe the Russian Revolution or different things like this. So I don't know what events I would pick. But the thing that we can see is that there is a progression that happens after October 22nd, 1844, that leads us to where we are at.
And
And that, yeah.
And one interesting point about this this idea that the trumpets are going to be repeated, so that the seventh trumpet contains a repetition of the previous.
Mhm.
One interesting point is that some of those trumpets, and specifically the fifth and the sixth, they have associated a precise time period. So they come with a time period. And it means that those time periods are going to be repeated as well. But probably not in matters of, in terms of 150 years and 391 years, but in literal days, probably, because the time is short this time.
Okay, well, so you're suggesting the idea that we could have a period of 150 days and 391 and a half days in
Yes.
connection with repeating of the trumpets. I don't generally suggest that. I mean, we do have in our history the 391 and a half, right? So that's going to be from October 13th, 2018 to November 9th, 2019. And with that history we had, instead of being the three, that was based upon both Ezekiel and Josiah Litch's prophecy. In Ezekiel, it's 391 and a half years. In Josiah Litch's prophecy, it's 391 years and a half of a month. So it's still a 391.5. So we applied that literally, but not necessarily in the same context of the woes themselves. That is, we're not marking a woe there, but we're using these symbols that come from these other histories as part of our prophetic time. That is, history, time exists in our movement. Time exists in Adventist history. So most Adventists believe after October 22nd, 1844, when Ellen White says time is no longer, the Bible says that, and Ellen White repeats that in relationship to Revelation 10, they would just say any amount of time, any sort of time period, any marking of any kinds of dates is what Ellen White is forbidding. But she's specifically saying that when time is no longer, that is, the time that's supposed to intervene from the beginning of the Day of Atonement to its end is not specifically marked out. But it doesn't mean that time doesn't exist. And we can look back on events and see that they're connected to time. So, but I wouldn't be, predicting, for instance, that you're going to have a specific number of days from some event that parallels the sounding of the sixth trumpet, and then to the woe itself, and then again for the fifth trumpet, and then the sixth trumpet ending and 391 and a half days. I mean, at least that's my suggestion. I don't think that we can do that, but we can use these symbols, and time does exist. Now, as far as the seventh trumpet repeating in our history, where would we place the seventh trumpet if it's being repeated? So if we're going to take October 22nd, 1844 as the seventh trumpet, but we're going to take it as, if we're taking the story of Jericho, and we're going to take those 7 times that they march around the city. And remember, this is just sort of discussion. We're not setting any of this in stone here. If we were going to place the repeat of the seventh trumpet, where would we place it?
That would be the loud cry. So what would correspond to the 1844 cleansing of the sanctuary and then the starting of the Advent message? That would be the loud cry in the future.
Okay, yeah, so the loud cry. And so one of the things that we note about the trumpets themselves is they lead us to a certain point in history, but they don't lead us to the second coming.
So
Because in Millerite history, they don't lead us to the second coming. They lead us to the beginning of the investigative judgment with the ark open.
in the fall of Jericho story in the Bible, we see typified the loud cry. So when after they sound the trumpets, then they cry, they shout with a loud voice. So this is a loud cry.
And the loud cry leads us to the close of probation. So even under the seventh trumpet, in this, we'll use the word speculative application, and we're going to place the loud cry as the seventh trumpet, we would see that all of those events leading to the opening of the ark in heaven are then repeated, but it's at the end, right? So this is still going to be a period of time. That loud cry is a period of time, and it leads to the event finally of the opening of the ark in heaven. So some of these events that we look at, so let's go back. So this is a study on the trumpets. So if we go back here into Revelation chapter 11, because that's kind of where that's where the seventh trumpet occurs, right? So we have the seventh trumpet. Now, we mark this as October 22nd, 1844, as Seventh-day Adventists. And we have to keep it there, because if we didn't, we have to reject spirit prophecy, because she's very clear on this. But we can see that this history is repeated, that the temple of God will be open again in heaven. And when we look at the hail there at the end, what is the hail? Has anybody ever done a study on hail in the Bible? What is hail?
The seventh plague.
Okay, it's the seventh plague. But just in a general sense, what is hail?
Frozen water.
Okay. Is it a stone that's made without hands? Is a hail a stone?
Oh, we do
Yes.
call them hailstones.
Right. Yeah. So hail is a stone that falls from heaven. And it's symbol of God's judgment. Correct?
It is.
Yeah, we know that the seventh plague is hail. And do the trumpets typify the plagues?
They do.
Yeah, because one of the things we see that about the sixth trumpet is the sixth trumpet addresses the great river Euphrates, right?
Yes.
Right. So when because we're gonna address this stuff tomorrow. We're gonna go into more in depth on the sixth trumpet and the woe itself. But when the sixth angel sounds, he's going to loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. Now, people make the mistake of thinking, well, since they have a lot of the same symbolism that you have in the seven last plagues, right? So the sixth plague, the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the waters thereof was dried up. And so they just say, well, they have the river Euphrates, they're the number six. So the six trumpets are still future, they represent the plagues, but that's not understanding how Bible prophecy works. Just because you have something that parallels or is similar doesn't mean it's the same event. And the one that we constantly look at, Revelation 12, the great red dragon, Revelation 13, of the composite beast, Revelation 17, the woman riding the beast, lots of similarities, but lots of differences. And you can't place them at the same time. So the same thing here with the sixth plague. So we're going to look into this in more detail. So the sixth trumpet as well, it has similarities, but it's not the same. But can we see that these trumpets typify the plagues?
Yes, there is a connection between the trumpet and the plagues, but there is also a difference in terms of intensity, because the trumpets, with the trumpets, the wrath of God is mingled still with mercy, but with the plagues, the wrath of God is not mingled with any mercy, because it happens after the close of probation. So
Yeah, and now other statements that Ellen White uses, trumpet after trumpet shall sound, vial after vial shall be poured out. This is the primary statement of spirit of prophecy that people will use to try to lead you to the idea that the trumpets are not fulfilled in the past, that these are just simply another description of events that occur under the 7 last plagues.
No,
Yeah.
I think this is a stretch. People that deny that the historic application of the trumpets, they try to take away some bricks, from the foundation of Adventism. I mean, that's exactly what it is.
Mhm. Yeah, but we can see that Ellen White does use that phrase, trumpet after trumpet shall sound and vial after vials shall be poured out. So we know that there are trumpets connected with the vials, that is, she's connecting them. Even though she looks at a historic application, I think that what she's simply doing is she's seeing the parallel between the two, and that the plagues are being typified by the trumpets. But now these are judgments upon whom? Who is the plagues? So we know that the trumpets are judgments upon Eastern and Western Rome, Western and Eastern Rome. And then the 7th is a judgment upon modern Rome. So are the plagues, in a sense, a repeat of the trumpets? I don't know if that's are they a repeat of judgments?
Yes, but with a difference in intensity.
Right, difference in intensity, and on a different group of people at a different time. And does that make sense that the Bible is going to use something that happens earlier, like the plagues that fall upon Egypt, and then use that typology for the plagues that fall at the end of the world? Or that it's going to use the trumpets and use a similar language? But nowhere would we say that it's referring to the same period of history just because it's using a similar language. So this making sense, what Christian is suggesting. Now, would it be necessary for us, or beneficial maybe even, to go through the history from October 22nd, 1844, and to mark out what we think are the application of the 7 trumpets?
I think it could be interesting.
Yeah. Now, could we somehow find that 9/11 fits into that structure as the third woe, that it somehow is connected with the first and second woe typologically in its chronology? So we have 9/11, and it's the third woe, because we talked about this. The first and second woe have time attached to them. The third woe doesn't specifically have a time period attached. The only thing is that we are told is that the third woe will come quickly, right? We're going to have Revelation 11:14. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe cometh quickly. It doesn't tell us when it comes, but we know that the third woe does not begin October 22nd, 1844, even though the Millerites, the early Adventists, apply it there. That we have to apply it to 9/11. And then we know that the third woe comes after the sounding of the 7th trumpet. But if those trumpets are repeated in our history, would we be able to line up the end of the second woe with the beginning of the third woe in some kind of structure? Should we be able to do that? That is, 9/11 occurs under the repeat of the sixth trumpet. Would that make sense to people?
And the interesting part of this exercise is identifying the time periods, the 150 days and 391 literal days leading up to the loud cry. I think that's the part that is would be the most interesting.
Okay, well, I still take what Ellen White says about we cannot know the definite time for the loud cry, the outpouring of the latter rain, the close of probation, the second coming, or any other promise of special significance. So I would still take Ellen White's words as saying that we can't know the timing of the loud cry. Because what we are measuring right now in this movement is not anything on the big line. That is everything that we have attached time to in this movement has been on this repeat of history that is encapsulated in events leading up to the Sunday law. That is, I don't think that we can see beyond the Sunday law as far as measuring time. That is, the loud cry happens after the Sunday law. And I don't think that we can measure that time. That's my view. So I understand what you're saying, but I think that we would find this time is connected to 9/11 and events in this movement, not to events on the big line, because 9/11 isn't on the big line. All of the events that we're looking for, that we have been looking for in this movement, are not on the big line. Even the Sunday law itself, we're not predicting the Sunday law. We just know because the Sunday law is on the big line. That's the next event. So this movement, its purpose is a repeat of the first and second angel's messages. And my understanding is that the repeat of the parable of the 10 virgins has time attached to it. But the third angel's message does not hang on time. Ellen White says it doesn't need time. But the first and second angel's messages needed time in Millerite history, and they need time in our history.
What about the fourth angel's message?
Well, the fourth angel's message is the other angel's message that joins, that has to do with the Sunday law. So again, I don't think that we can predict. Now, 9/11, we say that the angel of Revelation came down. But that's not on the big line, because in Ellen White, when she places it on the big line, she places it at the Sunday law. So in understanding that Revelation 18 applies to 9/11, we can only apply it to the repeat of history. That is, it's the repeat of the first and second angel's messages. So like when we look at the board behind me here, one of the things you see, and I don't know how familiar you are with this, what we've been doing, but if we take 9/11, and we're going to deal with this in the future, but you can see 9/11 has two different fulfillments. That is, even in our line 9/11 has two different purposes and marks two different periods in our history. That is, it's 9/11 itself only occurs once, but it serves two different purposes. And we can create two different lines with 9/11 in it. We can create a line where 9/11 is just August 11th, 1840. And we can also create a line where 9/11 lines up with April 19th. And this isn't well understood in this movement, because we just say 9/11 is one event, but it can represent two different events. And that means there's more than one line that we can create. And to understand which line we're using, that hasn't been done consistently. That is, we often even confuse our line with the big line, which we can't do. So this is an important point of midnight cry and the Sunday law from 9/11. The question is, what 9/11 are we talking about? Are we talking about the 9/11 that is parallel to April 19th? Or are we talking about the 9/11 that's parallel to August 11th, 1840? So these are going to be things that we're going to explore. And so even when we talk about the Sunday law, there's lots of different Sunday laws. And we can even say that this pandemic is a type of the Sunday law. So where do we place that? How do we understand that? What Sunday law are we talking about? Which line are we talking about? Those are things that we have to explore further. And, and again, I say it's not well understood. I mean, I don't even well understand it. So it's not like I'm saying I understand this and you guys don't. I'm saying we don't understand this as a movement. We haven't figured it out. We haven't sorted it out yet. And so we need to do that. Okay, so our time is up. Was that a useful exercise, Christian, in answering your question?
Of course, that's useful. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and we will explore these things as time goes on as well. Okay, let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are very thankful, Lord, for all the light that you have been giving us. We know that we don't understand things completely, but we know that you have been leading this movement, and we ask that we can search diligently for this light, that each individual can come to understand these truths, and that your people can be united in the work that is to be given us, and a message that's to be given to the Seventh-day Adventists who are searching for truth. Help us to be faithful in the little things, and we leave all things that are out of our control in your hands. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.